Welcome to the continuation of our series on the Philippine Creole. This is part 2. This is entitled Luis Rodriguez Varela and the Dialectics of the Filipino. Now, of course, for most of you, this is probably the first time you've heard of Luis Rodriguez Varela. And my objective today is to show you the shift from this notion of Spaniard, how it shifted towards the notion of Filipino in terms of the Philippine Creole. Because, as I mentioned last time, the word Filipino was seldom used. The term Filipino is somewhat used in the pejorative. The point here is, by not being born in Spain, one is automatically declared sort of inferior. And consider, for example, the idea that you cannot be considered a pure-blooded Spaniard simply because, let's just say, not in terms of your descent, but in terms of the place where you're born. Although we said that eventually, by the second or third generation, the Filipino is not strictly Spaniard born in the Philippines, that there are already mixed bloods considered as Creole, and that eventually wealth becomes the perceived proper measure of what it means to be Creole. But however, the term Filipino was never really used in the open, because these people are very much fixated to the term or the signifier Spaniard, that they call themselves Spaniard or Espanol. The word is seldom used because the Creole prefer to call themselves Spaniards, and considering their position in Philippine society, the Peninsulares were not in a position to question. If you remember the social pyramid, the very simple social pyramid that I presented last time, as I've said, my point there is to show you how many Peninsulares are there and how many Creoles are there. And as long as the Creoles are or were in the government or in the military or in the church, they were there to protect the interests of Spain. Because remember, they call themselves Spaniards. They are very much attached to the motherland, Spain. And as long as they are there, the Peninsulares are protected. But that also goes to show, just like what I've said, the Peninsulares or the governors general, they were replaceable. The Creoles were here to stay. But if you recall, in the later part of the last or the previous video, I said that the Creole were so powerful that even King Charles III himself had to satisfy them. Because in an attempt to capture the Philippine trade, especially that the Philippines is very much connected to China and Southeast Asia and the Spice Islands, the Spanish government wanted to really profit from the position of the Philippine Islands. Except that the galleon trade is not really, well, at least for the Spanish government, the galleon trade was not a lucrative trade. But when they started trying to earn from the Philippine Islands, they cannot really just get rid of the galleon trade. And that also has something to do with the Creole. That's why even if many of the Creoles were invited into the Sociedad Economica or the Real Compañía, they were still allowed to trade within the galleons. And that was because of they, or the Creole, proving themselves to be not a power to be messed with. Okay. Well, what we have here is that the Filipino, the term itself, is seldom used. This was, for the most part, a Spanish affair. That's why I said last time, this was the class itself was traumatic, because whenever we refer to them as Spaniards, and whenever we proclaim, for example, that the Spaniards are corrupt and they did not treat us that well, we are actually also referring to the Spaniards born in the Philippines. So Filipino in its original sense is defined by the presence of a lack, in contrast to the pure Spaniard. And that's the reason why this sense of lack, this sense of lacking the same quality of the bloodline, simply because you are born in the Philippines, you're born with the Indio. In a sense, you're almost Indio because you're a native of this country. It doesn't matter what the descent was. The term Filipino was not used in the open. Let's just put it that way. They did not use the term Filipino the way we use the term Filipino today. It's something like nobody can really openly say that they are proud to be Filipinos in those days. Okay? So, but then this guy came. Luis Rodriguez Varela. Born in Manila on February 13, 1768. He was educated in France. He became a knight under the order of Charles III in 1792. And in that same year, it was actually rumored in the Spanish court that he would later on be given the title of Count. Of course, that did not happen because of some troubles in Spain. But ever since the rumor emerged, this guy started calling himself Conde Filipino or El Conde Filipino, which was weird at that time because, as I've said, they don't usually openly call themselves Filipino, but this guy did. And when the French Revolution erupted, he actually supported the French Revolution in the year 1789. There's something very peculiar the way he used the term Filipino. It would appear that in our history, Luis Rodriguez Varela was the first one who used the term Filipino the way we use them today, or the way we use it today. His document entitled Proclama Historial, written in 1809. This has something to do with the failure of the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror, leading to the rise of, if you've heard of this man, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte ended up, let's just say, arresting and controlling the entire result of the French Revolution. And the French Revolution, or at least the ideas of the French Revolution, would spread because of Napoleon Bonaparte. But then what Napoleon did was, for example, he invaded Spain and installed his own brother. He started becoming, Napoleon Bonaparte started becoming to look like the very antithesis of the French Revolution itself. And considering that war was being brought within Europe, probably one of those world wars that were never really actually declared as world war, the Napoleonic Wars. And these wars were actually carried on in the colonies as well. France, of course, were already somewhere in the area in Southeast Asia. So this document, Proclama Historial, in 1809, was written by Varela in order to call for the unity between the Spaniards and Filipinos. Take note of that. Spaniards and Filipinos. It has nothing to do with Spaniards and Indios. It's Spaniards and Filipinos. And he would justify it in saying that for quite some time, Spaniards and Filipinos had been at war, especially in the south, at war with sometimes with the Moro, at war with sometimes with pirates all across Southeast Asia, at war with the Dutch. So he was trying to recall these images of what this union. Now, what we are getting at here is that there's an idea of union. that what the Spaniards and the Filipinos were doing all throughout history was actually something like a union, which was weird. Because for the most part, the Creole has always been, at least, proclaiming themselves Spaniards. Now, they're calling themselves, or at least in the eyes of Luis Rodriguez Varela, they were Filipinos. They are Filipinos. And one radical thing about Proclama Historial is that Varela seems to believe that anyone born in the Philippines is Filipino. Like almost exactly the way we use it today. I don't know personally how he pictured it, but his definition of the term Filipino is almost like a definition of citizenship. It doesn't matter whether you are white or brown or whatever your religion is. The term Filipino seems to apply to anyone born in this archipelago. And that was weird, because nobody before him ever imagined the use of the term Filipino in such a way. I'm not sure whether there were precursors to this, because our history never really, as I've said, the Creole were never really placed as a class who were active enough to transform the identity of the people of the archipelago. So, well, let's just say Luis Rodriguez Varela was the pioneer. And it was not just that he was a pioneer in the use of the term Filipino, he was also the one who pioneered the calling for reforms in the Philippines. Well, there are others, but his calling for reforms appears to be the precursor of what became known as the propaganda movement, especially in Rizal's time, from 1872 to 1892. But this was somewhere along the 1810. Varela's reforms, he was tasked to give instruction, or well, something. There was a Spanish Revolution. The Constitution of Cadiz was established together with the Spanish Parliament, the Cortes. The Philippines was to be represented, and Varela was to write the instruction for the representative of the Philippines to the Spanish Parliament. And these are examples of his reforms. The opening of free schools for the poor and local colleges, the pharmacy, mathematics, and navigation. The navigation is very important because as you might recall, there was a strong push by the Spanish government to really establish connections economically within Southeast Asia. So navigation became very, very much a requirement. The other one would be the limiting of Chinese economic activities, especially Spanish migration towards the country, because despite the usual picturing out of the Chinese migrating to the Philippines even prior to the coming of the Spaniards, they were not really coming here in huge numbers. Of course, they were usually here for economic trading purposes, but then because of the Spanish period and the booming of Manila, and then along these years, Año Dorado, the golden age of Philippine economics, especially with the economic reforms of Vasco y Vargas, there were callings already to limit Chinese economic activities and to support instead local ones. And this was also very crucial in the transformation of the Creole, identifying monastic hegemony as an obstacle to the development of the Philippines. For years, the Creoles, politicians or friars, have always been in power. politicians and friars have always controlled the archipelago. And now, there was a break. Many Creoles started interpreting the friars as a detriment, an obstacle to the development of the country. Now, we're looking at possibly the effects of the British invasion of Manila that happened many years before. And there was now a conscious effort to transform the colony into something more lively in terms of economics and to open up to capitalism. And of course, the friars didn't like capitalism. They branded it as something like the work of the devil or something like that. So the friction between the friars and many of the Creole who, as I've said, started going to the land, started managing haciendas, started becoming businessmen. Many of these Creoles were educated in Europe, educated in the Enlightenment, and then now they're actually calling for the possible limitation of monastic hegemony. And in fact, I think Varela wanted to limit them to the point of almost kicking them out of the Philippines. Varela also called for more Hispanization. So, I think Nick Joaquin mentioned something like, in order to increase the number of Filipinos, there has to be an increase in Hispanization. Even to the extent of providing allowance for couples who are Spanish and native, for example. I don't know, Varela must have thought that would be a good way to increase the number of the Filipino. Especially Filipinos who would then be wealthy and more capable of the threat of the Peninsulares are coming. The Creole probably were sensing that in the early years of the 1800s. Well, anyway. So, Varela's reforms actually sounded like almost like what Rizal and Del Pilar and Jaina would be calling for in the propaganda movement. Opening of schools, especially of Spanish language, that is also in line with Hispanization. The identification of monastic hegemony as a problem in terms of Philippine development. The call to limit Chinese economic activities and to favor local ones. These are more or less basically what the propaganda movement later on would look like. So what was really going on? And in the title of this video, I did say something about the dialectics of the Filipino. So here's the dialectics. Dialectics is basically something that would look like this. There are three moves in this one, in this dialectic. The first one, of course, is dialectics usually play in the head of the people involved. So, well, of course, if we look at number one here, the Creole has always, they always refer to themselves as Spaniards. It signifies superiority. It signifies the link to the motherland, to Spain. And it just sounded pure. There was a sense of purity when Creoles referred to themselves as Spaniard. It was as if for let's just say at least for 2 centuries, I think, more or less 2 centuries, the term Filipino was rejected in favor of Spaniard, because Spaniard actually links them closer to Spain, and in their perspective, it signals that they too are Spaniards, that there's nothing wrong with them. Right? But if you will ask a peninsular Spaniard, what they think about the insular Spaniard, they would probably say that they are not Spaniard at all. They are Filipino. But the Creoles prefer the term Spaniard, as I've said last time, and as what we will be reading later on this month. When they register themselves, they usually, like 100% register themselves as Spaniard. Their birth certificates, their certificates appear that they are Spaniards. They really prefer the term. Now, for number 2 here, the term Filipino, the signifier Filipino, was, let's just say, a kind of label used by the Peninsulares to call the Creole. As I mentioned in the beginning of this video, in order to create this space between what a Spaniard, or let's just say what a pure Spaniard is, a peninsular, a Spaniard born in Spain, if that make any sense. But anyway, a Spaniard born in Spain is a pure Spaniard. To give quite a distance between that kind of Spaniard, the term Filipino was then invented. Well, you're born in the Las Islas Filipinas, and therefore you are to be called Filipino. But then, the Creole never really consider the term Filipino as something that they can openly use, because the signifier itself marks their, let's just say, inferiority. It negates the legitimacy of themselves claiming to be Spaniards. So what we have in the term Filipino is a sort of negation. It negates what the Creole wanted to be. They wanted to be treated like pure Spaniards, but that is of course negated by the term Filipino. The term Filipino itself, therefore, the signifier, contains the sense of lack that I was talking about in the previous slide. And that's, for them, that was a bad thing. So the term Filipino itself does have a negative connotation. It does have a negating element to it. What the dialectics does, at least in the head of someone like Luis Rodriguez Varela, or maybe some guy like Manuel Zumalde or Jose Javier de Torres, is to shift the standpoint. So how does this work? Pure Spaniard on one side, Filipino on the other. The Filipino cannot be pure Spaniards. So the negative element of the term Filipino is that he or she can never really be a pure Spaniard, because he or she was not born in Spain. He was born in the Philippines. What Varela did is to transform, to negate the negation by transforming the negative element of the signifier Filipino to become the positive feature of the identity itself. What does that mean? If I am a Creole, and for years I've been calling myself Spaniard, imposing myself as Spaniard, in the face of the supposedly pure Spaniards like the Peninsulares. But I can never really be accepted as a pure Spaniard. That was the accusation. I cannot be a pure Spaniard because I am born in the Philippines. But instead of treating this negativity as something negative, it was negated as something positive. My being a Filipino, therefore, my having this lack of legitimacy, that I am not a pure Spaniard because I was not born in Spain, that becomes my identity. So in the eyes of Luis Rodriguez Varela, I am therefore not Spaniard, but Filipino. And this time, the reason why I placed the color here similar in color already, in similar shape, compared to this old notion of Filipino with so much negativity used in a very pejorative sense. By the time Varela used it, since you Spaniards cannot really consider us as, pure Spaniards like you, then maybe perhaps that is the point. The point being, we are different. We are not like you. We are Filipinos. The guy owned the name, owned the signifier, owned the label. If you keep on saying that the Filipinos are therefore not Spaniards, then so be it. We are not Spaniards. We are Filipinos. That's why Proclama Historial eventually would say something like the union or the cooperation between Spaniards and Filipinos. Filipinos being anyone born in the Philippines. And that is a very radical idea. Because this will start a kind of movement, maybe perhaps supported by the contingencies of the events of the coming of the Peninsulares. The idea would then be, if we are Filipinos and this is Filipinas, then what is a Spaniard doing here? That's the beginning of the nationalism, really. Maybe in some sense influenced by the French Revolution, but that's how it was transformed from a Creole claiming to be Spaniard, not liking the term Filipino, to eventually looking and using the term Filipino as a positive feature of the identity itself. By 1820s, is what happened really here was Spain was becoming, they really wanted to keep the Philippines, and so their solution was to keep on placing Peninsulares in the archipelago, and this would eventually result into an open conflict between the pouring peninsular population coming in from Spain, and not just politicians, but also the friars. And again, the friars in the church, because this will be the subject of the next video. By the time we will be talking about, say, in 1823, as you will be reading, when Varela was declared a subversive, was deported to Spain, the open conflict was inevitable. And also, I think in the same year, there was Andres Novales, who went into open conflict against the Spaniards here because the Creoles were being replaced by Peninsular military officers. The Peninsulares arrived to replace Filipinos, and this time we can, at least technically speaking, use the term Filipinos now, to replace the Filipinos out of key positions. Remember, these people have been in the government, military, and the church for quite some time. As I've said, even government posts were already hereditary. The Peninsulares came and replaced them, and the open conflict was really starting to blow up. And of course, as you will read, Andres Novales declared himself emperor in the trying to imitate what happened in Mexico. But there was then an open conflict between the Spaniards, and this time, not just Creole, but Filipino. And that would be the topic for the next video. See you.